The trade deadline is quickly approaching in your fantasy league, and there's some wide receivers right now that you should be targeting. I believe that the 7 wide receivers in this video are currently underpriced in the market, meaning that you could buy low on them and improve your team right now. And we'll start with one that you're probably not thinking about, and it's Mike Evans. I think now is the time to buy Mike Evans, because heading into week 8, everybody was saying, okay, who are the wide receivers that are going to replace Mike Evans, who's out for a couple of weeks, and Chris Godwin, who's done for the year? The popular choice was Jalen McMillan, a rookie who looked exciting. Okay, he had 7 targets this past week, but he really didn't do much with that. In his performance on those 7 targets, you get 4 catches for 35 yards. People thought that he would take over this Chris Godwin role. They thought that Jalen McMillan, the rookie who's looked okay, not great, not elite, nowhere near that this time at times this year, people thought he would be the slot wide receiver. But plain and simple, he wasn't. He played on the outside with second-year player Trey Palmer, while Sterling Shepard commanded the slot, that very valuable role in this offense. Baker Mayfield loves throwing to his slot receivers. We've seen Chris Godwin have a ton of upside with that role this year so far. But Sterling Shepard is 32 years old. He injured his hamstring in that game, and now overall, the wide receiver room just looks like meh. Because in week 8, the leading receivers for this team was tight end Jaden with 9 catches for 81 yards, multiple scores, and then the running back, 7 catches for Bucky Irving, 5 catches for Rashad White. The 2 main running backs on this team combined for 12 catches on 13 targets, so I think that's what we're going to see moving forward. The running backs involved in Jaden being the priority. So the answer to which one of these wide receivers is going to fill in for Godwins and Evans is probably none of them. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Jalen McMillan, who's seen 15 targets the last 2 weeks, can't pop off for a 20-plus yard touchdown on the outside and have a nice fantasy day. Trey Palmer, who has some of the best speed we've seen enter the NFL the last few years, he can't pop off and have a nice fantasy day. I'm not saying that these guys can't have a pop-up week here and there. They're just not going to be consistent producers like many people expected when they spent $40 of their fab on Jalen McMillan. So while everybody's worrying about which random Bucs wide receiver who doesn't have a ton of upside is going to be the next guy, I'm just going to say I'll take the actual guy, Mike Evans, who should be returning in a couple of weeks after the week 10 bye for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It makes Evans a clear buy for me, and if you're a team right now that's lucky enough to be 6-2, even 4-4, heck, even 3-5, I think you can get away with trading for Evans, who I would consider right now a top 10 wide receiver the rest of the season, because once he's back, he doesn't have to compete with Chris Godwin for targets. And the encouraging thing for me was that the Bucs offense didn't fall apart this last week without Godwin and Evans. We still saw Baker Mayfield, although he had to throw 50 times, completing a good amount of his passes, 330 yards, multiple touchdowns in this game. Yes, he did struggle and have some miscommunications with his wide receivers, but that's to be expected when you're down your top 2 guys and you're playing rookies and second-year players for the most part. But once Evans returns, all that miscommunication should start to come down a little bit, and again, we did see a nice performance from the Bucs last week. Now, Evans has started and completed 5 games this year. This is the 5 games right here, the game logs according to Player Profiler, and in those 5 games that he started and completed, a number 6 wide receiver finished, a number 5, and a number 8. So he's finished as a top 10 wide receiver 3 times in those 5 completed games, and that's with Chris Godwin in those games. When he comes back, he won't have Godwin, so I think this guy has a ton of upside, obviously weekly once back. And if he indeed returns in the week 11 game after the bye, he'll face the Giants. That's a fine matchup. Then he gets the Panthers, a fantastic matchup. A fine matchup against the Raiders, but more importantly, look at his fantasy playoff schedule. A matchup against the Cowboys, that is a bottom 10 secondary right now, and then a matchup at home in the fantasy championship, if you were fortunate enough to make it there, against the Panthers, which is a bottom 5 secondary right now. I think Evans has a very strong rest of season schedule, and assuming he's back in week 11 with no complications, is a great buy low right now. Now, the next player I'd consider a strong buy low is Amari Cooper, who had a frustrating day in week 8. If you're a fantasy manager of him, which I am, I was expecting big things. He had a solid performance, scores a touchdown, multiple catches in his debut on a short week, and then does nothing in week 8. Remember week 7 when he only plays and runs 34% of the routes, but he still earns 16% of the targets, is targeted on 42% of his routes, which for reference would easily lead the NFL, right? It was a small sample, 5 targets on 12 routes run, but he ended up having like 4 catches, finds the end zone, 16 fantasy points, and now he had a whole nother week to practice, but it didn't lead to anything. Because although the usage nearly doubled, 63% of the routes run, the actual targets and volume he was getting didn't. Just 6% of the targets in this game. That translated to a very poor performance. We'll pull it up right here for Amari Cooper. Cooper goes out there, he catches just 1 ball for 3 yards. He only earns 2 targets. And you know what happened on his other target in this game? He slipped in a game that there was some rain, some mist during it. He slipped and that ball was intercepted for Josh Allen's first interception of the year. So like literally as bad of a performance as you could have in week 8. And what made it even more frustrating was that these other Bills receivers who have been on the team all year and really not done much for the most part, they went off. 9 catches, over 100 yards for Khalil Shakur, leads the team with 10 targets. Keon Coleman for the 2nd straight week, 5 catches, 70 yards, a touchdown, continues to produce after the catch on 7 targets. Heck, even Dalton Kincaid earned 7 targets. Like all the guys that the Bills already had on their roster are producing, and the guy that was supposed to be the producer, that's why they traded a 3rd-round pick for him, Amari Cooper, at least in this game, failed. But there are a few things to keep in mind here. As I just showed you earlier, he's still in a limited role. He's only running 63% of the routes. That'll get to the 80s to 90s once he knows the full playbook. And this game also featured some bad weather, and we should also note that Amari Cooper is known for being a boomer bust, some upside weeks, and then he disappears some weeks in his NFL career. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened here. There's other factors like the limited role, like the new offense, like the weather, but it's not something you should just be giving up on Amari Cooper because of one poor performance. We literally just saw the week before, while playing like 25% of the snaps, he had a nice game. And overall, if we take a step back, it's been about a week and a half since he's been on this team, maybe 2 weeks now by the time you're watching this, and they traded a third-round pick for him. They clearly plan to get him involved, and his quarterback is Josh Allen, maybe the best quarterback on the planet. So expect a larger role in future weeks, and I know he probably cost you your matchup this past week if you're a fantasy manager. Hold on to him, and if you're not, go ahead and buy him, because look at the schedule coming up. At home against the Dolphins, that game could feature a lot of points. Great matchup against the bottom 5 Colts secondary. At home against the Chiefs, that matchup could feature a lot of points. But more importantly, as he enters the fantasy postseason, the Rams bottom 5 secondary, the Lions, which is a secondary you can definitely attack if you have a good enough offense, and then the Patriots as well. I think that this is a fine rest of season schedule for a guy who should be earning 25 to 30% of the target share most weeks for the Bills moving forward. I'm trying to buy low off of a 1-catch, 3-yard game on Amari Cooper. And for the people wondering, like, who should you trade Amari Cooper for and try and get in deals? Well, I do have a tool. It's my rest of season rankings, my trade tool. This is last week's version. The new version is about to release right after this video. By the time you're watching it, it's already out. And it just shows you exactly who are the best players rest of season. So obviously you want to trade for the guys who are higher up on this list. And you can get access to that with over 20,000 other people as a part of my fantasy blueprint right now. And you can get access to that tool and everything else my fantasy blueprint has to offer to help you win your league with the link in the description below. You can check it out right here. You click this get access button and it takes you to this page where you can sign up through our partner Underdog. It's very simple. You sign up through them because the blueprint becomes risk-free. And one more thing is this right here. I just took this play over on Underdog. Amari Cooper for more than 48.5 receiving yards. I think he bounces back. And Drake London for more than 65.5 receiving yards. More on him later. That's a foreshadowing. I think he bounces back. I took these two plays, $50 to win $150. You can tail them as well. And here's the thing. When you sign up for Underdog, it's a one-time payment of $10. You get my fantasy blueprint. You can use that $10 to take that play that I just showed you right here, this Amari Cooper and Drake London play. And if you do not make your fantasy playoffs, well, then I just refund you your $10. You reach out. That's why this is completely risk-free. So simple as that. You follow the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code on the screen right now to get access to my fantasy blueprint. You can take that play that we just showed on Underdog that I have for this week and join the 20,000 other people smacking around their league mates with the blueprint. Back to the wide receivers you need to be trading for, and I want to talk about Davante Adams, who so far through the first 2 weeks with Aaron Rodgers, this connection has not really hit off, right? In week 7, okay, he ends up playing 98% of the routes, so he's not limited at all in his first game back, earns 19% of the targets. So overall, in your first game back, after being out with an injury, a hamstring, after not playing with the Aaron Rodgers for years, being on a new team, not bad usage, but it only resulted in 3 catches for 30 yards. But we can blame this on a tough matchup on the road against Pittsburgh. We can blame this on the Jets offense stinking, and in general, Davante Adams only having like 4 days to adjust to his new team. However, it starts to get frustrating for fantasy managers when they see in week 8, Adams once again sees a lot of the usage, 100% of the routes out there for every play, earns a very good 28% target share. So again, all the underlying data is completely fine here for Adams, but he goes out, he has just 4 catches for 54 yards, only gets you 9.4 fantasy points, and now it's starting to become an issue. If you're a Davante Adams fantasy manager, you're looking up and you're seeing just one game of over 10 fantasy points on the entire season, and that was all the way back in week 2. Like, you're looking through the game logs on Player Profiler and you're getting, look, this 26-point day in week 2, then he ends up missing a bunch of games due to injury after he puts up 8 points, so he's the wide receiver 53, the wide receiver 51. This past week, he's like the wide receiver 45, and it's just starting to get really frustrating because you've gotten one usable week out of him all season, and that hasn't been for about 2 months now. And if you watch this game, there's clearly some rust going on with Davante Adams. Again, as could be expected due to an injury, being on a new team and not playing with his quarterback for multiple years, but there was multiple times in this game, like Garrett Wilson was clearly just 1-for-1 with Aaron Rodgers. They knew what they wanted to do. They were on with all the routes that they were targeted on for Garrett Wilson and Rodgers. But for Davante Adams in this game, there was 2 times, and I think pretty clearly 2 times, definitely once, where there was just miscommunications. Adams was either running the wrong route or did the wrong thing. That's not something we're used to seeing with him and Rodgers. But again, this should get healed over more practices together. But the fact that right here, these game logs have not been good all year long and haven't been good for about a month and a half and hasn't been usable is opening up a buy low window on Davante Adams, who I still view as probably a top 24, definitely a top 30 player rest of season. If we redrafted today, he's a 2nd or 3rd round pick. Because when we do look at this data yet again, like everything underlying is looking good. He's out there for every single route for the most part, 99% of the routes the last 2 weeks, and he's seen a 19 and 28% target share. Like, this is vintage Davante Adams, a 28% target share. Sign me up for that. I get that he didn't find the end zone this past week, but even this performance of 4 catches for 54 yards, it's not the best, but it's not awful. If he finds the end zone on just one of these, which he will as weeks go on, then we're not worried at all about Davante Adams. There's no buy low window, but he didn't find the end zone, so there is a buy low window. And I think this is probably your last chance to buy him, because yes, they play on Thursday Night Football this week against the Texans, a banged up Texans team. Okay, whatever happens there, happens there. But look at the rest of the schedule here. Matchup against against the Cardinals, bottom 10 secondary. Colts, bottom 10 secondary. The Seahawks, bottom 10 secondary. And then you enter the fantasy playoffs against the Jets and Rams, 2 bottom 5 secondaries, and then a matchup against the Bills, which could feature a lot of points. And in general, the Bills secondary has been hit or miss depending on how good the offense they are facing. So I think the rest of the season schedule for Adams is good, and honestly, the underlying usage for him is good right now. He looks healthy, he's fine, and this rust will wear off with him and Rodgers, so try and buy low if you can. And then for this next situation, let's take a look at the Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver room, where I do believe there's a buy low in this spot. Now, DeAndre Hopkins made his NFL or his Chiefs debut this past week, and here's what he ended up doing in this game. We were told he would see significant playing time. That was kind of a lie. He ran 33% of the routes. He's targeted on 21% of his routes, so that's decent. Just overall 9% of the targets, so that's just 3 targets overall in this game, but again, he played like not even half the game. Now, the expectation coming into this was that DeAndre Hopkins was going to play a lot more and play a lot in the slot, that Rashee Rice, Juju Smith-Schuster role, but he didn't. 95% of his snaps were on the outside, so my guess is with more practices throughout the week, he'll get more adjusted to that slot usage and role. So I would just say, in terms of DeAndre Hopkins fantasy managers, you're in a much better situation, obviously, on the Chiefs, and just give him some time. The 3 targets is not indicative of his role moving forward. He'll continue to get a lot more usage and probably be the number 1 receiver on this team with a lot of top 24 weeks moving forward. But the thing that was interesting to me, this is not a thing to say go buy low on DeAndre Hopkins. I think you should do that. I think it's fine to do that. But the bigger takeaway for me is that for an even cheaper price point, I think you can buy low on the first round rookie receiver with the 4.2 elite speed, fastest combine time ever, right? Xavier Worthy, because I can't help, after watching the film this past week of this game, I can't help but think like they're trying to get this guy involved so much right now. As you can see right here, over the last 2 weeks, since the Chiefs bye week, you had a 32% target share coming out of the bye week on 8 targets. And this past week, with Hopkins playing about a third to half the game, a 24% target share on about 8 targets again. So he's averaging 8 targets per week since the bye. And this past week, it came together a little bit for him. 4 catches, 37 yards, and a fine matchup. 13.7 fantasy points is not going to be anything crazy that makes him like somebody you can't go out and acquire right now. But I do think he's still a buy low player. I don't think he's a number 1 receiver on this team. I think that's Hopkins, but I do think it opens some things up for Worthy. Because surely you're going to get more usage out of Hopkins on this team, but then you look at the rest of the wide receivers here, and like Justin Watson, Juju, whenever he returns, I don't think these guys are going to be on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. I think it's going to be Worthy, assuming that we continue to see some nice progression and development out of his game like I saw this past week and a little bit the week before that. More importantly, they just want to get this guy involved. If he doesn't have to have the pressure to be the guy who's the number 1 receiver, they lean on him for all these big plays, and now that's Hopkins, the veteran, who can do that. I think it does open up some pressure off of literally his shoulders for Worthy. And more importantly, I don't think it's really going to cost you much at all. People probably don't view Worthy as anything more than like a top 75 player rest of season. Now, the next guy who I think is a priority player to go and trade for right now is Jaden Reed, who, look, it's been a poor past 2 weeks for Jaden Reed. If you pull this up right here, ever since Romeo Doubs complained and got suspended by the team, what has happened for Romeo Doubs? Well, he's been having a couple of really nice weeks, and Jaden Reed the last 2 weeks has basically been doing nothing, the last 2 to 2.5 weeks. And now we can look at a situation on the player profile. These are the game logs right now for Jaden Reed. You scroll through this, you have a 6-point fantasy day, a 10-point fantasy day, and then you have a 3 and a 7-point day. So now in 4 to 8 games, so half of his starts this season, Jaden Reed has had 10 or less fantasy points, which is honestly, when you look at that on the surface, it seems like he's a boomer bust receiver. But this needs a lot more context, because in 2 of those games, Jordan Love didn't play. They were running the ball heavy with Malik Willis at quarterback. And this past week, Jordan Love only played like a quarter before re-injuring his ankle and his groin. But when the fantasy managers start to look and say, what have you done for me lately? They'll see that they've gotten 3 points and 7.5 points out of Jaden Reed. That's not great. They'll actually then go out and see that the Packers are involving everybody right now in their receiving game. The last month, Josh Jacobs has a 12% target share, which is very good for a running back. Every single one of the wide receivers on this team, all 4 of their main wide receivers, have at least a 13% target share, including Dontavian Wicks. Obviously, the tight end, Tucker Kraft, is involved. So you're going to have these boomer bust weeks for each of the receivers, including Jaden Reed, and it's going to get even more concerning because of this right here. Christian Watson played more snaps, ran more routes, and saw twice as many targets, as you can see right here, according to PFF, than Jaden Reed in week 8. So all of this is bad news for Jaden Reed, and the fantasy manager who has Reed is starting to get a little bit worried, especially now that Jordan Love is once again injured. Jordan Love injured his groin. It also looked like he injured his ankle earlier in the game, and right now he has a shot to play in week 9. A shot to play is fine, but here's the problem with this. He's going to be facing the Detroit Lions, who even without Aiden Hutchinson can get pressure on the quarterback. That's a concern for Jordan Love, and the Packers have their bye week in week 10, so they could just play it safe and let Jordan Love get healthy, because one game against the Lions isn't as important as the rest of the season being healthy for Love. But if Jordan Love doesn't play in week 9, you're probably getting the performances like you got earlier this year without Jordan Love out there and Malik Willis out there, and that's these games right here for Jaden Reed. 6.6 fantasy points, 10.9 fantasy points, and that was a struggle to get to 10 points. And if that happens for Jaden Reed, well, now you're in a situation where Jaden Reed isn't producing for you in over a month of the season, because then the Packers go on bye in week 10. So I think all of these downsides, all of these negatives right now can play into your favor if you're a team that's in a position to be able to trade for Jaden Reed, because I still view him rest of season as like a third or a fourth round fantasy pick, and that's valuable. I put him in the same category as Deebo Samuel and Tyreek Hill when they're healthy, as a player who can just change the game with one play. They're that dynamic and explosive both as a runner and a receiver. And that is literally what we just saw this past week on this play action pass from Malik Willis that goes for 50 plus yards on the final drive of the game with a minute left in the game, and Jaden Reed basically wins this game after a short field goal by Brandon McManus for the Packers. Like, that is the type of play that he can make. They're scheming him specifically into the offense. That play right there that I just showed you, this play wasn't even in the playbook this past week. It was added to the playbook on the sideline about one drive before this because Jaden Reed said he saw something from Matt LaFleur. So Reed's obviously great, and just to get an idea of how good he is, he ranks third on the season in fantasy points per target. He's also third. I mean, basically, if you look at any efficiency metric right now, third in expected points added right now. That's just overall his wide receiver efficiency. Second when he's targeted by his quarterback. So the quarterbacks, when they're throwing to him, he's literally the second most efficient wide receiver in the NFL from the Jordan Love to Jaden Reed connection. And I think this is only going to get stronger as the year goes on. Even if Jordan Love doesn't play in week 9, coming week 11, the Packers' big boy part of the season starts to kick off against the Bears, the 49ers, the Dolphins. These are a bunch of playoff potential teams. The Lions again, the Seahawks, like all playoff potential teams. And that's when you have to rely on your best players. And in my opinion, the best player, not named Jordan Love on the Packers, is Jaden Reed on offense. Now, this next player returned from injury in week 8, and he looked great, but I still think you should be able to try and buy him right now. But before we get there, over 60% of you are not subscribed to this channel. We're getting into the wee parts of the fantasy season. So if you're still here, it means that you find these videos valuable. The gentleman's agreement time right now takes 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button. These videos take a lot of time. So if you find them valuable at all, 6 to 8 hours to make these videos, all you got to do to pay it back is hit that subscribe button. So I appreciate y'all in advance. It goes a really long way. Now, that player who returned from an injury in week 8 was Chris Olave. It was a concussion. And honestly, early on, it looked scary. He got out of the game and was being evaluated for yet another concussion, but he was able to return and quietly had a strong day. Because in week 8, with multiple different backup quarterbacks, Olave sees a season high 14 targets in his first full game without Rashid Shaheed in a tough matchup against the Chargers, one of the better secondaries and defenses in the league, and he puts up 8 catches for 107 yards. In this one, goes for about 20 fantasy points. And like I mentioned, the most impressive part about this was he didn't have Derek Carr. He didn't have a quality quarterback. He had Spencer Rattler, who struggled for the first half and really 3/4 of the game, and then Jay Kaner came in and took over, and honestly, Jay Kaner looked even better for Chris Olave in this one. Now, coming out of this game, we got some good news that the team and head coach Dennis Allen are optimistic that Derek Carr with his oblique injury will play in week 9. Now, if that's the case, it's fantastic for Chris Olave. Obviously has multiple years of connection with Derek Carr, where he leads the Saints team over the last 2 seasons in target share, and moving forward, he won't have to compete with Rashid Shaheed, which is very important because as you saw in his first game, 92% of the routes, that should only be higher. He had to leave for about a drive or so with the concussion getting checked for, but a 36% target share was a season high. It is the highest that I've seen really in like the last 1.5 to 2 years for Chris Olave, and I don't think that it's a coincidence that he does this in his first game since Rashid Shaheed was injured, because he really has no other wide receiver or competition in any form on this team for targets. Like, let's look at this team right now. You have Mason Tittman, an undrafted free agent, who in my opinion just really a speedster, doesn't do much from a route progression standpoint. Cedric Wilson, who's now dealing with an injury himself, but in general, an aging veteran. You have Bub Means, left last week's game with an injury as well, considered day-to-day. Like, none of these guys. The tight end room, Taysom Hill is still banged up. Nobody's in the tight end room. Alvin Kamara on checkdown targets are not really taking away from Chris Olave's downfield usage. There's like no one for Olave to compete with right now. And that's why, in my opinion, the 30% target share day we saw this past week, 36% to be exact, can honestly just be what we see moving forward for Olave. And you're going to get Olave in some situations where he has great matchups. If we look at Olave right now, moving forward, matchups on the horizon against the Panthers this week is fantastic. The Falcons is a fine matchup. The Browns defense is not what it once was, but look as you enter the fantasy playoffs. The Rams, the Commanders, bottom 10 secondaries. The Packers, which is a secondary you can definitely pick apart. The Raiders, like when the toughest defense that Chris Olave is going to face entering the fantasy postseason right now is either the Raiders or the Giants secondary, you know you have a good rest of season schedule. So I'd be trying to buy low on him, and also Deontay Johnson, who as of this report right now, Deontay Johnson, the latest news we have as of this recording, this might change by the time you're watching this, I understand that, is that Deontay Johnson is expected to be traded by next week. This report came out on Monday. I'm recording this video on Tuesday afternoon to go out on Wednesday because you have to edit it and get it up in time. So if that news breaks tonight, I think no matter where he goes, it's an upgrade for Deontay. So try and get a trade done before the news happens ideally. And I'm buying low on Deontay either way. Like, even if he stays on the Panthers, I'm buying low because I think people are looking at his value as nothing right now just because he's been banged up. But when he's been healthy this season and not having Bryce Young as his quarterback, it's been good. And I'll show you just how good in a second, but there's also a world where Bryce Young just has like one good game this upcoming week and then they try and trade him before the trade deadline because reportedly a lot of teams are interested. And if the Panthers put him out out there all season and he continues to stink, that value in trades is just going to plummet. So if he has one good week, they can just try and sell high, just like we're doing in fantasy right now. They can try and sell high on that asset. But let's just look at the game logs right here. In week 1 and week 2, 3.9 points and 4.5 points with Bryce Young. But then quickly after that, he's a top 10 wide receiver, 26 points. A top 10 wide receiver, 21 points. He leaves this game early with an injury with Andy Dalton, 5.9. And then he comes back the following week, a top 12 wide receiver. So in his 3 completed games without Bryce Young as his quarterback this year, he's been a top 12 wide receiver every time, looking extremely efficient and finding the end zone in all of those matchups. So I believe Deontay is worth buying because no matter which situation he goes to, even if he ends up being the wide receiver 2, if he ends up going to the Bucs and Mike Evans returns, or goes to the Buccaneers, or goes to the Commanders and Terry McLaurin's there, I still think that's a better situation than being the wide receiver 1 for Bryce Young. And then the final guy who we foreshadowed earlier in our fantasy pick'em over on Underdog, this play right here, the over Drake London 65.5 receiving yards paired with Amari Cooper. Again, take that down below with code SAL. You'll get 100% deposit match and my fantasy blueprint. Well, this guy, Drake London, I think is a buy low right now because he just had his worst game since week 1. He had just 4 catches for 34 yards. He dropped a slant early in the fourth quarter that probably would have gone for 5 catches for at least 40 to 45 yards. Looks a little bit better at that point, and who knows what happens from there. But just 7.4 fantasy points as Kyle Pitts scores multiple touchdowns, as Darnell Mooney scores a touchdown. Everybody else was scoring and playing well, Bijan Robinson as well, except Drake London. Now, I don't think the fantasy manager who has him in your league is going to immediately try and get worried and sell Drake London, but it's at least worth asking what they're thinking because Drake London still ranks 3rd in targets on the year. He's top 5 in receptions. He's top 5 in first read target share. He's the clear number 1 option on this passing attack. And if you look dating back since week 1 when the whole offense stunk, it's only been wheels up for Drake London. He's had 6+ catches in every single one of those games. And look at this, 17, 19, 12, 33 points in that game, 19, 18 points, right? He's just going out there and averaging for you like 17 fantasy points per game, but he just had 1 stinker. But again, people might get a little bit worried. They might be in a situation where the rest of their team is injured and they need to sell Drake London for multiple assets. Those are the types of managers you should be reaching out to. Because I don't think moving forward, we're going to have Kyle Pitts leading the team with 91 yards. One big play of this, 40+ yards, came on a broken play where he's left wide open. I don't think that Darnell Mooney's going to lead the team in receiving yards. I know he's been good this year. I know he's been explosive downfield, but I just don't think that these are going to be the case. Bijan leading the team with 7 catches? No. I don't think Drake London will be the number 4 option on the team moving forward. I think it's going to be more so like weeks 2 through 7 when he was clearly the number 1 option, averaging about 8 receptions per game. So I still view Drake London as a top 20 player rest of the season. And that's not just at the wide receiver position. That's a top 20 overall player the rest of the season. Would easily be still a 2nd round pick if we redrafted today, maybe even a late 1st round pick in some 12 to 14 team formats. I think if you can get a discount on him right now, take advantage of that. So these have been the wide receivers you should trade for before week 9 begins. And if you want to see the running backs that you should also trade for, and there's a couple of really good ones before your trade deadline hits in a couple of weeks, well, you can check out this video right here. Might just be your favorite of all time on YouTube. So check it out. And before you go, make sure to hit that subscribe button.